it contextualizes why our prison populations look the way it does. It contextualizes why there's a wealth gap. It contextualizes all of these negative stereotypes that we hold that render them baseless, which really threatens the current racial social hierarchy.
We're gonna be in for a ride today, so.
Well, I think it's, some people might listen to the podcast and maybe be, I don't know, possibly confused as to why we're talking about economic justice on a criminal legal podcast. But I think there's a very quick web we can draw, or a timeline, where we're starting at slavery, and then there's the Emancipation Proclamation, and then we see the Freedmen's Bureau come into play, where the banks or individuals who have now been freed are able to put their money into banks, which leads to millions of dollars in this bank, which ultimately then the bank collapses. It's kind of timely that we're talking about this because the Silicon Valley Bank just collapsed.
Yeah.
We have a federal government who's willing to bail them out. And so all the people who have deposited money are able to get those funds back. But at that time, especially because of the context of the individuals who were investing, there was no refund, there was no bailout. And so all that money just disappeared. And so, as Ashley Bell talks about, there's this inherent distrust of the banking system and the American economic system amongst a lot of the Black communities. And so then we see migration happening. And so now we're jutted into the 1900s, the mid to late 1900s, around the 60s, 70s, and we're seeing people, we're seeing deindustrialization around the 70s and white flight. So white individuals are getting housing vouchers to essentially create the suburbs, which is leaving Black populations and marginalized populations within the urban centers, which now have no industry. And so there's very little job opportunity, and now there's very little housing opportunity, not only because of white flight, but there's also redlining. And so these individuals aren't even able to purchase homes, and they're not willing to, the banks are not willing to give loans to Black folks specifically. And so this is where we see then the economic disparities exacerbated. And then when we think about why most people engage in criminal behavior or illegal behavior, a lot of it is because of a lack of resources. And this very directly ties to what we were just talking about. And so then you have a disproportionate population who are being both engaging in criminal behavior, but also being criminalized and hyper surveilled. And then they're being put in prison. And then what Ashley talks about, which we can get into later, is that investors don't trust these people then. And so because you have a criminal record, and we know that the prison population is disproportionately Black, then we're expanding that wealth gap, because now that's an additional barrier beyond solely their race that limits their ability to obtain wealth through home ownership, because they're not able to get those loans because of A, debt and poor credit scores, and then B, on top of this new model where you're having private investors taking on those mortgages. Those white people don't trust, Black people with criminal records to pay their bills on time. They don't know. They're so far removed. And so to appease that, there's this 7-year space that Ready Life has to implement, where individuals are able to bank with Ready Life and get a mortgage if they show that they can pay their rent on time, only 7 years after the commission of a criminal incident. And so again, this is just, it all deeply ties together.
Yeah, I think it also deeply ties together because when Ready Life was giving their presentation, they were really talking about how Frederick Douglass at the time was not even really involved in banking. And I think when it comes to kind of criminal justice issues, we've always had a problem in this country to figure out what we do with groups of Black people and migrant people, right? Just groups of people we just don't know anything to do with. And so with Frederick Douglass, he was tasked with really helping the federal government figure out what they're going to do with all these free Black people. And you can put that to all other groups. I think we're thinking about, how do we think about that for immigrant populations? Like, how are we thinking that for homeless populations? We haven't done a good job of understanding what to do with groups of people who are not ingratiated into our society. And one of the things you see, like as Frederick Douglass is trying to work with the government to say, okay, how can we integrate Black people into kind of the mainstream society? One, they say, okay, we'll create this bank and really do that. And once all of that is washed away, one of the things we often talk about is that it lends itself to a great argument about the social conditions that are created that we see in our country. And they come directly result of this Freedmen's Bank. So you have all these Black people who are migrating to Chicago and Philadelphia, New York, and all across these United States, and are trying to get on the right accord. And now we understand now, and on top of kind of the Black wealth diminishing, it creates these really interesting social conditions where people can't get loans and people can't do things. And I think the conversation was so interesting to me because we've oftentimes talked about abolition. And what Ready Life is doing is saying it acknowledged that the credit scores, or the way we think about who we lend to, doesn't really make sense, right? Like there's this idea that a certain amount of people are going to have above a 700, almost 50%, and some people are not, right? And so can we think about or reimagining a system where if somebody is able to pay this rent for $2,000 a month, then of course it can make sense that people could also pay a mortgage, and that they might even care more because it's a home. And to be able to recognize that that's what we need. We don't need to continue to have banking process as normal, right? Because we understand that that gap persists for something that happened in time. And one of the things we're saying is that is true. We can also mirror that for other criminal justice practices. We're saying, hey, you know what? It really doesn't make sense, right? To lock people away for X amount of years, knowing that they're going to come back to the community at some point in time. Is there a way, possibly, maybe, if we can think about doing something differently? And I think people get scared because of abolition, because it's like, well, we can't do it differently. It doesn't make sense. What if it doesn't work? Like, what about people that don't pay their mortgage? And like what Ready Life was talking about, like it makes sense that if somebody is doing something here, that they could do it over there, right? So we are making sure that people have resources to rehabilitation, right? If we're caring about people's development, their reintegration, if we're doing that in prison and in carceral spaces, or reimagining things differently, of course it will make sense that it could happen on the outside, right? But we have to have people who are brave enough to reimagine a different future, because it just cannot persist. I mean, we talked about that, today's money, if that Freedmen's money there, it'd be $65 million, right? And there's no way that you can just easily catch up. And a lot of people often say, oh, why can't, the solutions of the Black community, they can just do this or do that. And so now you talk about people who are distrustful of banks, that is breeded really in the community, right? And so a lot of people don't trust banks. They don't grow up understanding how banking works, a checking and a savings, right? And how money can work for you. And so all of these things really add into that. And I think Sarah Brain writes an article about this idea of system avoidance. Like, I think it's a really great article because she talks about kind of the surveillance of different things, but also how Black people may avoid different systems that have been oppressive or have not worked for them, right? And so you just can't go in life. And it's always interesting, like a criminal record is similar to a credit score, right? All of your delinquencies and it goes away, I guess, after a certain period of time. But as far as how you interact with the world, that's what people see first, as far as like lending practices, right? And that becomes really important.
Yeah. Oh my God. I have so many threads that I want to pull on. The first one, you were just saying how Ashley's essentially saying if they can pay $2,000 here, then why couldn't they do it in this context? And as you were saying that and thinking about the prison context, I was thinking about how we know that the majority of people who are incarcerated for a violent offense. And so there's this perception that individuals who are violent, are dangerous, are always going to be violent. And then I was thinking, like, you don't see people in prison endlessly like killing each other and brutalizing each other and fighting each other. Like, that's a very, and I think that surprises people because I think that's their perception, but that's actually a very rare occurrence. And some people might say, well, it's not happening because they're so hyper surveilled and they're not able to move freely. But there's a lot of moments where there are opportunity for that. And a lot of people aren't engaging in that. Like 3% of the individuals who were incarcerated for a homicide offense are rearrested for a homicide offense upon their release. Only 3%. So most people are not engaging in the same kinds of violent acts that they were incarcerated for. And so thinking about, I was just thinking as you were saying that, like, in what other context, what kind of community-based context could individuals be in if they're demonstrating that they're not engaging in violence in prison? But so that's one thread. The other thread, thinking about credit scores, I think I would be so curious to ask Ashley if he would think that he's like an economic abolitionist, because because it very much is, as you're saying, like, this doesn't make sense, we're going to try something else. And I think, you know, it's curious to me when he's saying that he is actually supportive of capitalism. He was like, I think he said something along the lines of like, capitalism, it was like low key a little bit of like, it's not the guns, it's the people. It was kind of like, it's not capitalism, it's the way that people use capitalism. And I really question whether capitalism and equality can coexist, because capitalism is so deeply based on inequality and social hierarchies in terms of having ownership and then having employees and having this kind of stacked bureaucracy. And the way that he is describing the investment in individuals' mortgages, to me, sounds like socialism. And the way that we're bailing out banks today, that the Silicon Valley Bank, the way that we're bailing them out, that's a socialist act. Like, we are stepping in to help the community by distributing the wealth in that way. And so and you and I had spoken about this in some other episodes of just like questioning and critiquing capitalism and how capitalism deeply plays into a lot of our instances of injustice, racial, social, economic, political. It's interesting.
I think theoretically the concept of capitalism is intriguing, right? This idea of a free market, decentralized government, right? All the things that, while we're academics, right? The ability to have autonomy.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, the reason why that capitalism and equity or equality may not work is because we just haven't seen good forms of capitalism. And this is not to like go all conspiracy theories or anything, but most people, most billionaires, or most of the families, DuPont, Ford, Mellon, if you look into their history, it's a history of either slavery, like you have to do something that is kind of so inequitable, or some really kind of shady business practices to amass a wealth for this. So it's not like these people have kind of pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, right? Somebody, and also I was reading an article which like blew my mind, because you know, as people are kind of revisiting history, most of your insurance companies, they used to insure like people's slaves, right? And they kind of like got all this money. Like, it was, so you know, like all of the kind of great things we see in our society has these roots where it's like, all right, okay. And I think that's really interesting. I think one of this, when I was talking about it, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and I was wondering why I was kind of getting emotional, kind of like just hearing the podcast, and I remember, because it affected me. Like, I remember, and it's so weird, you know, me, I'm not an old person, right? Just 29, but I remember we lived in kind of really a rough part of South Philadelphia. Like, my dad used to take like bullet holes out the windows, and my parents were working really hard, you know, 2 jobs, and they had saved up enough money to move me and my brother at the time to a newer neighborhood. So we're going to like the other side of South Philly, which was predominantly white. And they were kind of going to see houses and just being denied after denied for no reason. They're good credit. And then for some reason, they just said, you know, they were going to just try one more time. But the realtor, I think, was a little bit lazy. And my mom's name is Martha and my dad's name is Antonio.
Mm.
And he sold them the house without ever meeting them because he had automatically assumed that they were white and they were Italian. And that's how we moved to the neighborhood. It was kind of completely night and day. Like in one neighborhood, we had this kind of sweep the streets, had block captains. The new neighborhood we moved to had street cleaning, right? I remember it was a really interesting thing because I live right next to a playground. Like my house was like right here in the playground. We never could play in the playground because they like sold drugs. There's like a lot of crazy things that happened. And I remember one of my white friends, Jonah, was like, "Hey, do you want to play baseball in the street?" And I looked at my mom and she was like, "Go ahead, it's fine." I just thought that was like a
Mm.
setup. Like, hold on, lady, what's kind of going on here? But this ability that, how we think about housing, how we think about what people get into, I think definitely affects the people's lives, right? And I wasn't born in like the 50s or the 60s, but that's something that
Right.
really resonated with me. And I think I had different, opportunities. And when Ashley was saying that it's expensive to be poor, like I saw that for other family members who, didn't have the abilities that my parents had by kind of just moving us to a new neighborhood. And I think those are all the things that make sense.
Mhm.
And I think when we talk about abolition, and you saying you want to actually as an economic abolitionist, I think, there's so much, there's a continuum about abolition, about how people feel. And, some people just want to kind of tear things up and blow things up. And sometimes that's needed. But I think of abolition as like, I think we can clearly agree, even with the kind of the Silicon Bank failing and different things, that our systems as they are kind of currently constructed just don't work well. I think we can kind of just have a general consensus there, right? And I always tell people if we can agree that this doesn't work well, I mean, things in financial aid and
Yeah.
things how we do in higher ed. Like one thing, I don't even have a late policy in my class, right? And that could be abolition. I just don't believe in a late
Right.
policy, right? Like how many times have you gotten extension? I'm like, listen, if you need more time, you say, I think this is a due date when you should get it in, right? And that's like that blows student mind. Like I don't really have a late policy.
Yeah.
But if we agree that the system or the way we're doing things are not helpful, we just have the agency to say we can do something different. I mean, I think that's kind of the core of what abolition is. And I think sometimes we let, maybe due to the media or other thoughts about abolition because it's kind of seemed crazy because that's the way we've always done it. But just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean it's the best way that we can do it. And also, I think we're just so fearful of kind of engaging with something new until it works, right? And I think I was watching like the Uber thing, and they were like, nobody's gonna ride in a stranger's car, right? Like nobody's. And now I just think about, it's like I can't imagine a time where
Yeah.
we didn't have Uber, right? But a lot of people just that was very revolutionary, right? And I think that's probably what Ashley is saying. Like capitalism kind of feeds that kind of sort of right, that intuitive, right? Because I don't know if it works well for like equality or equity, but it is the idea that the bottom line, like even I think if you think about the civil rights movement and the Montgomery bus boycotts, it was like, okay, that affected people's bottom line. And so,
Right.
it was good for business, capitalism, not to have things segregated. Now, I don't know how we feel about that. I have thoughts about my morals and stuff, but capitalism breeds these type of changes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So in Phoenix, I'll send you a video, but in Phoenix, they've been piloting Waymo, which is a driverless car, like driverless Uber,
Oh,
essentially.
I've
And
heard that.
oh, it's wild. And it's like, yeah, this is the next step of
Have you
transportation.
done it?
Yeah, I did it. And it was like really impressive. Like it did this left turn on like a very busy, like 6-lane street. I was like, but it did really well. So yeah, thinking like, okay,
Wow.
yeah, but also like I think in terms of where we've seen small abolitionist acts like you're describing, and how Ashley brought it up too, was during COVID. Like we
Yeah.
saw
Yes.
a universal income, right? Like
Yeah.
that was helpful. We
Yeah.
saw that there was a decrease in arrests, and we saw that people, as he said, were able to hold off on giving their mortgage payments because they were strapped. And the thing is, like, what's unfortunate is that it has to occur for all of us in order for people to feel invested and to make those changes, when, as he very poignantly and accurately said, is that like the conditions that most of us were under for that time period have not gone away for certain communities, right? Like there's still an economic drought for a lot of these communities where there still are no job opportunities, where there's still a lot of discrepancy in employment and the ability to pay different things. And so it just, and thinking about employer discrimination, right? Like we know we've had endless studies in the criminal legal field where a white person with a criminal record is more likely to get a call back than a Black individual without a criminal record. And actually, there's other studies that show that in states where they have banned the box, where employers are not allowed to ask about a criminal record, actually Black men specifically fare worse in the employment field because there's already an assumption. So Blackness is almost used as a proxy for criminality in those states. And so thinking about employer discrimination and the difficulty of getting jobs, and then because, you know, in the interviews that I did with Black fathers in Southwest Philly, they're like, I'm hustling on the corner the same days that I'm putting in endless job applications because I need to support my family one way or another. And so they're putting themselves at risk. They're putting their families at risk, even though they very much don't want to and are very honest about that. They want to be part of the global economy. They want to be in a legitimate workforce where they don't have to look over their shoulder. And yet, because of discrimination, they're not able to. And so then they are more likely to get swept up in the criminal legal system, which then perpetuates the discrimination. And so it's just this endless cycle.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, you know, what I love, Ashley, and people may say, well, why are we talking about this and what's going on? I believe that whether you're in criminal justice, sociology, social work, economics, that us as scholars, you know, a lot of times people say, oh, you know, that was slavery, that was a long time ago. You know, we kind of need to kind of revisit. I know this critical race theory. We haven't done a good job. And I was talking to John Eck about this. We take some walks on Saturdays. Scholars have not done a good job. Police and Scholar, University of Cincinnati, you should look up his work. It's really great. We haven't done a great job studying the Black migration. We haven't done a great job studying Reconstruction. And when you really start to study that time period, and you think about it as Reconstruction, right? The Civil War, I think there's like the 155 years since the Civil War or something like that. They were saying, like, when you think about Reconstruction and how the Civil War, you know, between the two Confederate states, the United States, and how we had to redo things different, a lot of the practice that we have today was based off all the things that happened out of the Reconstruction period. And so we're going to be interesting about the origins of our disciplines or how even things kind of mapped up. We really have to really then understand this really time period. I don't think that we gave a lot of time to this. That's why when I was preparing for the podcast, I you know, Marcus, he wrote this book and he was from Philadelphia, and this is the first scholar I ever read. I went to go visit him at Yale, and he signed my book, and and he gave it to me, and I just kind of put it on the shelf. And then like I took it home and I started reading it. And for a long time, I was really interested about these ideas about Reconstruction and migration. And you know, he looked at Du Bois's work, The Philadelphia Negro, which is kind of the first big study to understand Black people who have migrated from the South to the inner city. And basically, he maps out in this book the reason why Philadelphia is shaped and created the way that it is now was due to things that happened out of the migration. He talks about, like, you know, there was a big housing collapse that happened on South Street. So like South Street was primarily where like Black people live. Now that area is like very affluent. It's predominantly white, but he talks about how all of that changed and how we see things in our nation really resulted from that time period. I don't think that we've done enough justice to really understand that. And one of the critical points he says about the book is, that's why I feel like we have to be a student of history, is when we talk about abolition, you know, we talk about progressive policies and politics, there's progressive prosecutor's office. And when he talks about the Freedmen's Bank specifically, and he talks about all the money that was lost, he was saying that, you know, kind of in the justice reinvestment, like we don't need any new, I know people have been talking about reparations. We don't need any new money for reparations. Margaret says basically from the Freedmen's Bank, you get all those ancestry.com records. They come from the Freedmen's Bank. You could literally the government could be in right standing. I know they had joked the Biden Harris has the student loan forgiveness, but the $65 million, you could return that back to the families or the people of those families who are still living.
Yeah.
Right. There are concrete things that we can do to address these inequities, right? And to think about how we can then move forward, because I just don't believe, even as Ashley said, if we don't begin to think about things differently, like credit scores and criminal records and all types of things, then we're going to continue down this path that just does not make sense and is not fruitful moving along forward.
I really struggle when you're talking about the importance of learning about Black history, where we're also at a time period where there are numerous states banning the education of Black history, right? Like critical race theory is essentially Black history, which gives us, as we've demonstrated through this episode, a very clear line to today's conditions. It contextualizes why our prison populations look the way it does. It contextualizes why there's a wealth gap. It contextualizes all of these negative stereotypes that we hold that render them baseless, which really threatens the current racial social hierarchy. The last thing I'll say about the podcast, and I really appreciated how it ended with a call to action.
Yes.
I really liked that Ashley was like, look, I'm working within the constraints of these investors, and this is what they feel comfortable doing. But if you have the means to purchase a mortgage for someone that these investors might not be comfortable investing in, but you feel confident that you are understanding of the context, you have a better pulse on how these communities got to this point, and so you have faith that there's a way to pull yourselves out. Therefore, if you have the funds, purchase these mortgages for these individuals so that they are paying you directly, and therefore you're making a percentage on that, and you don't necessarily have to profit off of that, but you can use that additional funds to then fund another mortgage. And again, this is very much a socialist way of doing things where you're spreading the wealth. But I loved that. And I think that's really we need to think seriously about that and what that could look like, and how, if we are working within the confines of the system, if we are not abolishing our banking system tomorrow, is this a viable way to act in an abolitionist manner within the confines of the system? I loved that call to action, and I think that there should be a way that we can try to get some kind of funding for a nonprofit that can then engage in this way.
Yeah, I love it. I think, again, it's this idea that people have agency. We have the willpower to change the system. And this is one mechanism by which we can do it.
100%. Well, thank you all so much for joining us in this episode. And again, email ccofficehours@gmail.com with any additional feedback you have or any questions you want us to answer. And we'll talk to you next time.